Welcome, and thank you for joining this Ropes and Gray webinar. My name is Tiffany, and I will be the operator for today's call. Today's webinar topic is using IP to visualize and characterize an organization's capacity for innovation. And now, I'd like to turn the call over to Jim Myers, a partner in the IP litigation group at Ropes and Gray.
It's February 10th, 2015. Time for the Ropes and Gray IP Masterclass. Today's topic, using IP to visualize and characterize an organization's capacity for innovation. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. You're going to have the ability to send text questions using the questions box at the bottom of your webinar screen. You simply type in your questions at any time and click submit, and we'll try and address them either during the presentation, but most likely at the end. You're muted, and so this, the questions need to be submitted in writing. Either Gary or I will see them. In order to receive CLE credit, you're going to need to fill out the attorney affirmation form that was included in your registration confirmation email. You can find that in the resource widget at the bottom of the webinar screen. You're going to need to send that form back to professionaldevelopment@ropesgray.com, or quaintly, you can still fax it to 617-235-9606. Let me take a moment to introduce my friend, Gary Markovitz, today's speaker. Gary and I have known each other now, I'm not sure for how many years, but it seems like a substantially long time. Gary is one of the most interesting individuals I know on the planet. Gary developed much of the patenting program at IBM by identifying work that really mattered, that made great patents. A bunch of the patent lawyers, the patent licensing people you hear about a lot. But what Gary does and did is identify technology that matters and technology that can really move the needle for an organization. Now, after he worked at IBM, and he had a number of very important jobs, including managing the largest software development organization at IBM Fishkill. He was IBM's worldwide computer integrated manufacturing program manager. But after leaving IBM, Gary consulted on intellectual property strategies for Intel, Motorola, IBM, National Semiconductor, Shell, Cadence Design, and a number of parts of the armed forces, especially the Navy's insight-driven innovation, but also it's been used by the Air Force, the Army, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. There have also been a variety of Fortune 500 companies that have consulted with him, including Boeing, Caterpillar, Coca-Cola, and Procter & Gamble. Today, we're very privileged to have Gary talk to us. He's got 6 U.S. patents, PhD in mathematics, a master's in physics, and he's a U.S. Army veteran and served in Vietnam in 1968. Gary, welcome to the IP Masterclass. I'm quite interested in hearing the further developments and refinements of your strategies.
Jim, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Okay, I really appreciate that. And like you say, we've known each other for a long, long time. And every time we get together and discuss something, it's always exciting because something new always comes up. So I really appreciate the relationship with you and this opportunity to present to the audience today. Okay, as Jim mentioned, we've done a lot of work with the Navy, and I want to give the Navy a lot of credit here because the work that you're going to see was funded over the last 5 years by the Office of Naval Research, Dr. Larry Schutte. All right, it also involves some people that were really gifted thinkers in terms of innovation. All right, Mr. Garth Jensen, who was the Director of Innovation for the Naval Sea Warfare Center in Carterock, right? Dr. Jack Price, who runs the R&D shop there, okay, Dr. Dale Moore, who runs the strategic cell for the Naval Aviation Warfare Center down in Patuxent River, okay. And more recently, Mr. Bob Smith, who is running is the director of the Disruptive Technologies Organization at ONR, and Mr. Tom Bleasley, who is the deputy director of Lakehurst 4.8. Okay, I really want to give credit to these people because they have really influenced our thinking along the way, and they were willing to take the risk on a model that had no proof in the beginning. So I'm going to show you some of the results and also end up the talk with where we're headed next. Okay. Okay. Let me go on and advance to slide 2. Right. And basically, we're going to talk about 5 concepts today, and I want to start out, though, with the definition of innovation. Innovation is one of those words that if you ask 10 people, you'll get 12 definitions of innovation. To some people, it's a new idea or a concept or something like that, an invention, right? To others, it doesn't become an innovation until you've taken it from your mind to the marketplace and people have benefited from it. That it's, right? What we do is we use a very general definition of innovation. Right? We look at innovation as the acquisition and application of knowledge and skills that changes the behaviors of people and creates value. Okay? For us, that's what an innovation is. And so we see innovation everywhere, not just in the technical domains. There's innovation in all kinds of policy. There's innovation in finance, all right? And there's innovation in every corner of your corporation, every corner of your corporation or organization, right? And in fact, when you look at it, you have to have innovation in every corner of your corporation, or you're not extracting the maximum value out of your human resource, okay? You're not utilizing that collective intelligence. I want to talk about 5 key concepts, right? The network model of innovation is the first one, and we'll show you networks based upon patents. You have to have some marker of creativity, and we happen to choose patents because it's publicly available. And we can compare any company or any organization to any other organization because the data is publicly available, as opposed to internal emails or internal technical documents or internal funding flows and things like that, which are other metrics that we can use to characterize your innovation networks. Once we started building this model of an innovation network, what we found is that we discovered some things that popped out of the network analysis. In other words, we applied the existing social network mathematical analysis to these innovation networks, and some really interesting characteristics popped up. One called the innovation backbone, another one dealing with the propagation of knowledge, still a third one with a metaphor that we call the innovation genotype, right? And we'll talk about all of those. I'll close the talk with the 5th concept because moving forward, what the Navy has us doing now is helping them to create cultures of innovation. So we've gone beyond the individual innovation networks, and we're now looking at how do you create the policies and the practices that grow those innovation networks, right, that build the trust, that allow for the propagation of knowledge. Okay? All right. So what is an innovation network, right? Let's talk about this network model. First, I want to show you schematically what an innovation network looks like, right? Basically, it's a collection of people. All these little blue nodes, these blue dots, are individual people, right? And I've called out 4 of them here, A, B, C, and D, right? So those people possess the tacit knowledge to solve the problems of your corporation, right, to be competitive, okay? The network, which is gray lines, right, simply indicates the connectivity between those people, okay? And you can see here that not everybody is connected in the schematic diagram of a network, right? The group in purple, highlighted in purple, there's person D, like in David, right? They're sitting out there all on their own. You can also see that between the other 3 major clusters, right, there's only a finite or small bridge between them, okay? And you should worry about this type of topology. It says something to you about the propagation of knowledge, okay? So the whole model really boils down to that the individuals possess the tacit knowledge. The networks enable the opportunity to share that tacit knowledge. Remember, the new knowledge is generated when one person makes their tacit knowledge explicit to somebody else. And they take that new knowledge and combine it with their own tacit knowledge to come up with another combination. And if that combination is novel, non-obvious, and useful, it could be patentable, right? The third thing is that it's the challenges that provide the motivation to share. People aren't just sharing because they're connected. They share because they have this challenge, right? We want to solve a problem, okay? But in the end, right, as Covey has pointed out, it is trust that determines the willingness to share, okay? If you and I both have passive knowledge, but we don't trust each other, we're not going to share that knowledge. So if you look at this, you want to capture it in one sentence, what you would say is that new knowledge is generated and propagates at the speed of trust in a connected and motivated network of creative people. And that's really the key behind this whole model. We're looking at innovation as a social phenomenon. It is a contact sport between people that are motivated by a challenge and that trust each other enough to share their information. Okay. That model is a simplistic model. I want to show you an actual, I'm sorry. Before I do that, what I want to say to you is, for those of you out there who are worried that this is going to be a theoretical talk, okay, it's not, right? In fact, the challenge from Garth Jensen when we were building this model is he wanted to have a model that was highly measurable. In other words, he wanted to be able to go in and say, look, I want to make an investment in Carter Art's overall capacity for innovation, right? But to do that, I've got to be able to measure the existing state as is today and the new state once we apply this intervention, okay? And so what I want to explain to you is that this model is highly measurable. In fact, back in 2006, I was on the President's Council on Competitiveness, and in subsequent councils, they developed this set of metrics that you see here, 4 generations of metrics of innovation, right? And what I want to tell you is that this network model of innovation, all 4 generations of measurements apply to it, all 4. And in fact, the things we've been learning, like the backbone and knowledge propagation, right, and genotech, really fill out that 4th generation. They give us a way using network mathematics and science, okay, to make that 4th generation, to measure those intangibles like trust, okay, to measure the topology of the network, right, to measure the propagation of knowledge, the system dynamics. This model makes that all very feasible. Okay. All right. So now what I want to do is I want to show you an innovation network. Right? This is one that we mapped out using patents. And as I said before, patents are publicly available, so it makes it really easy to compare between companies and organizations and all kinds of things, right? Now, having said that, patents can also be limited, right? Not every organization patents all of their inventions. For instance, in the Navy, right? When they're working on things that are classified, those patents will not appear in the public database, right? But there are enough patents that you can usually characterize an organization quite well, right? And if you have to, you can go to other dimensions. You can look at email traffic. You can look at funds flow. You can look at internal documentation, right? And in every case, what you're trying to do is to understand the social relationship between 2 creative people. How often do they get together? What do they work on, right? What do they produce? What's the creative product that comes out? All right, so this one happens to be a commercial organization that we did, right? And every blue dot, again, is an inventor. Every gray line means that those 2 dots that are connected by that gray line have invented together 1 or more times. Now, you're probably asking, well, why don't you scale the width of those lines by the number of inventions that those people have been co-inventors on? We did that in the beginning. It gets awfully messy, right? And you start to lose a lot of the structure. But that's always a possibility. We choose, in these particular models, to just say that they've invented together 1 or more times. You'll also notice that there are things that look like engagement rings. There are blue dots that have a gray circle attached to them, okay? Those blue dots with the gray circle attached to them, that indicates that that person has 1 or more patents on which he or she is the sole inventor. There are no co-authors or co-inventors there, okay? So the first thing you're going to notice out of these 562 inventors and almost 1,200 inventions over a 5-year period, that the predominant mode of invention is co-invention. And you should expect this, I think. The problems that our corporations are facing today, that the Navy is facing today, are complex. You know, the myth of the lone inventor sitting in the garage, you know, inventing everything by themselves, that's rare, okay? Today, the problems are so complex that you need a chemist, a physicist, you need a software programmer, right? You need all kinds of people to produce, in the end, that innovation that will be useful to whoever your customer is, okay? So what about this network, right? First thing I want to do is I want to basically show you some of the topology of it, because it looks pretty interesting, right? It's got a lot of shape and a lot of form to it. Well, one of the topological aspects of a network is called clustering, okay? And when you look at it, I've highlighted here 3 clusters with a large green circle, a red circle, and a blue circle. Okay? And you start to ask yourself some questions. Why are these clusters the way they are? Right? Why is it structured this way? Why do I see such a dense red cluster there when it's encircled by red, right? So what we find is that when we create these maps, they don't necessarily answer the questions for leadership. What they do is cause leadership to ask a lot of questions about this structure and why is it the way it is. Now, let me show you a little bit more, a couple more structures, and then we'll start asking some of those questions that leadership asks when they see these. Okay? The next structure you should be aware of are isolated clusters. They're circled here in this odd red-shaped ring, okay? And these are small clusters of people that have invented together or alone, right? But they're not connected to the major clusters of your organization. These clusters should worry you. Why are these people not connected? How will the knowledge they've created propagate to the other people? Remember the model where it says that people will share knowledge with each other if they trust each other? When you see people inventing together, that's a signal that there's trust between the two of them. You know, you tend to invent with the people you trust. When you come up with a new idea and walk into work in the morning, you don't walk down the hallway and look for the first stranger that you could talk to about your idea, right? You go and talk to somebody that you trust, okay? And so you start asking questions about, you know, these isolated clusters out here. What's different about them? Why aren't they included in a larger group? Okay? Should they be included in a larger group? Let me show you another structure, really important structure. Okay? This structure is the structure of bridges, right? These people that you see highlighted in the red circles here, right? They are providing the bridges or channels between major clusters. Okay? They are important because these people understand what goes on in these two different clusters, and somehow they're looking and finding the innovations at the intersection. They're finding with one foot in one cluster, another foot in another cluster, they can combine ideas from those two different clusters together. Okay? That's an important role. Now, let me show you one extreme example. And this example comes from the Navy. Right? This happens to be the Warfare Center out in California that develops all the explosive ordnance, right? Now, the blue oval that you see on the top there, those are the inventors that build the weapons systems. The blue oval to the right and down at the bottom, those are the people that are located about 3 miles away from the upper group out in the desert. And those are the chemists that develop all the really energetic chemical formulas that provide the energy for an explosive weapon, okay? The person in the center, the large red sphere, is a person who was the only one that spanned between these two groups. He worked for the Navy for 35 years. He retired. He came back and he worked for the Navy for another 10 years at $1 a day. Okay? He passed away. There has not been another single invention that spans both halves of that organization, the upper blue and the lower blue ovals, okay, since he passed away. Not one. Right? This man was so beloved in the Navy that when I interviewed some senior people about him, they actually started crying. Right? This guy had this social relationship between these two groups that was the blue. Now, wouldn't it have been wonderful if Navy leadership could have seen this diagram long before Ron passed away? Right? Wouldn't it have been great if Ron could have mentored a replacement so that these innovations at the intersection of these two groups could continue? Okay? This is the kind of question and the kind of responses you're going to get when you can realize and visualize and characterize your own innovation networks. You're going to see where the choke points are in the network. You're going to see where the strengths of the network are, where the weaknesses of the network are. Okay? And you're going to start to ask questions of key people. Right? I'm going to explain this later on, but the nodes in this diagram, the diameter is related to a property called between its centrality. And that turns out to be a very important property, which we'll discuss a little further on in the next section when we talk about the innovation backbone, right? Now, let me go on. So why should you even care about this network topology? Okay? And for instance, why did the network have the structure it did? Sometimes we find it's because of geography. These groups are just physically separated. Sometimes it's because they're different technology groups or different product domains. Right? Sometimes there are good reasons for it, but other times there are artificial reasons. For instance, we found that sometimes this topology develops because of profit and loss accounting policies and practices. In other words, one cluster has one color of money and another cluster has a different color of money. When from an innovation perspective, they should be working together, but their accounting principles actually keep them apart. We've often found that funding policies and practices can develop the topology of the network, right? One of the funding policies and practices we've looked at is a very competitive one that causes every engineer and scientist to go and compete for the money that they want to get in this organization, right? And what that does is it develops a culture that's kind of like Lord of the Flies, right? Where I don't share my information with anybody else because you might use that information to get the same money I'm chasing, right? And while on the surface, competition looks like a laudable goal, underneath, it's destroying the innovation networks in those organizations, okay? What would be the optimal structure? Do you want an entirely connected network? I don't think so, right? You do need to have some competition between different groups. You do need to avoid groupthink. And if everybody is connected to everybody, it might be too easy to slip into groupthink and not see that disruptive new business process or new technology or new thing that you should be aware of, okay? So it's not clear exactly how it should be, right? But one thing I can guarantee for you is that you'll start asking those questions when you see the topology of a network. When you see who the bridges are, you're going to start asking, who are they and how are they performing this function? And by the way, most of the bridgers that we've talked to, and we've done 6 Navy laboratories and multiple corporations, and we've interviewed people from 5 Navy laboratories, 71 people as a matter of fact, okay? And what we find is that the bridgers usually do the bridging just by force of their own personality. They're just that kind of person that wants to get up and go out and talk to others and make contacts between people, right? They're the connectors, okay, that Gladwell talked about in The Tipping Point. Okay? But, how many connectors do you need? And where you don't have them and you're isolated, should you put connectors in there? Do you need more bridgers? Okay? And by the way, should bridging be an official responsibility? Should they be rewarded and recognized for it? These are the types of questions that you're going to ask as a leader when you see the topology of your network. Okay, let's go on to the next concept, the innovation backbone, right? The backbone in an animal is really critical because it carries all of the signals from all parts of the body, from the muscles and the organs to the brain and back and forth, right? And basically, the innovation backbone is the analog in innovation. Okay, so let me show you what it looks like. Okay, this is the same network again that you saw before. Now, we characterize this network using a network parameter or a network characteristic that's called betweenness centrality. The way that betweenness centrality is calculated is it's a function of how frequently you, inventor number 1, are on the shortest path between any 2 other randomly chosen inventors. Okay? Now, what's important about being on the shortest path? Well, it turns out that if you look at social networks, 2 people that are directly connected to each other usually have high trust. Okay? If you jump to the next degree out, the trust goes down a little bit. In other words, if Jim and I trust each other and Jim introduces me to a friend of his, that person will probably trust me based upon Jim's recommendation. All right? However, if that friend has introduced me to a friend of his and so on, pretty soon the trust gets down to 0. Okay? So the shorter paths are the ones that are the trust bridges across your whole network. All right, so we took the calculation and then we normalized it and multiplied it by 100. And on the left-hand side here, what you're going to see is this is the graph of betweenness centrality from 0 to 100 versus the number of the inventor. What you've got is 562 inventors. 149 of them have normalized betweenness centrality greater than or equal to 1. That's not much, okay? And by the way, if we take the 30th people, the 30 people with highest normalized betweenness centrality, and we turn their nodes red, and we turn the 1 degree link out red, right, you get what you see in the graph here. What appears is a backbone. a backbone that spans almost the entire network except for the isolated clusters, right? This is the 80-20 rule of innovation. A small fraction of all inventors form your innovation backbone. Okay? We have seen this phenomenon in every Navy lab that we looked at and in every company that we've looked at. It is a part of social nature, of human nature. Okay? You will have an innovation backbone, and these will be very, very important people to you. The next slide is one of the Navy Warfare Centers. This is their innovation network, and I just wanted to show you that just as before, that they display a backbone too. All right? And here, we picked 40 of the highest normalized betweenist centrality, and you can see the backbone going across this entire network. All right? So the question comes up, who is the innovation backbone? Who are these people that are so special? Who are these folks that own all the betweenist centrality? Okay. Well, we interviewed 71 of these people in the Navy labs, across 5 Navy labs, right? And it turns out that they're one of 3 types. They are either the deep subject matter expert, the person who has forgotten more about a domain than anybody else ever learned. Okay. The second type, right, is the type of person that owns a facility that enables others to do their development, their research and development. For instance, a person that owns a nanotechnology lab, or a person that owns a simulation suite. Okay. The third type are very interesting. They are the internal entrepreneurs. These are the people, and since we were using patents, these are the technical people, right, that actually get up, get out of their laboratories, go out, meet the customer, find out what the problems are, round up the funding, come back, and put together a network of the first 2 types, the subject matter experts and the technical capabilities owners, right, and solve the problems. Okay. They share some common characteristics. We find that they're highly self-motivated. These are people that do not wait for management to say, go solve these problems. These are the people who go out and find out, this is the problem we should be solving. Okay? They are the centers of knowledge creation and knowledge flow. Because they are on the shortest path between any 2 other frequently on the shortest path between any 2 other randomly chosen inventors, they are either involved in the generation of or propagation of knowledge. Okay? These are the people we found that truly understand how innovation works in their culture. These are the folks that have made it work. Very often we find they're the wild ducks. They're the ones that are breaking the rules, okay? They're not following the pattern that everybody wants them to follow. Okay? The other thing is, because they are on the short path, they are the trusted influencers that reach across your network. Okay? That's really important because as leaders, you know that you can't change everything on your own. That you need a team of people that are trusted by your organization to make changes happen. So how can the backbone help? They can provide advice and counsel to leadership on innovation. And in fact, in several of the Navy labs now, they have formed advisory councils comprised of people from the innovation backbone. And these councils are working with the directors of innovation in these labs and with the technical directors of these labs to put together the ideas that are identify the things that either inhibit or promote innovation. Okay? And then the leadership is taking this input and deciding what changes to make in policies, practices, and other things, okay, so they can increase the capacity for innovation. This is a very valuable team, right? They provide a source of best practices. They know how to make things happen. They propagate interventions to increase innovation. If you involve this team in designing your interventions, they will have skin in the game, and they will help propagate it back out. They will make it a success, all right? They reach across organizational boundaries, okay? And that's really important because we all know in a large corporation, sometimes those organizational boundaries, those silos of excellence, are pretty thick walls. And they provide an outstanding network of mentors. In fact, what's really interesting about it, when we asked many of these backbone people what was responsible for their early success, their answer was that they were lucky enough to have a great mentor when they first joined the Navy. Okay. So the question of leadership is, how will you manage your backbone, right? Who comprises it today? And who will form the backbone tomorrow? Because when you think about it, it takes time to accumulate a collection of patents for any individual inventor. So I have to tell you that most of the backbone people that we interviewed were senior people, okay? But we asked them a simple question. Who do you think, which young researcher is going to be ready to take your place when you retire? Who's going to be the next backbone inventor? And they could identify those people. So the question to leadership is, what do we do with the existing backbone and with the future backbone? How do we train them? How do we fund them? What positions in the organization do we place them in, right? You know, how do we help them to maximize their contribution to our capacity for innovation? And what are their career or development plans? Are you recognizing them for this key role? A role that before we mapped the network was probably invisible to you. That was the other interesting thing too. When we asked people to identify a priori, who they thought the backbone inventors would be, there was very little overlap between the names that were given by management and the names that appeared in the network analysis. Okay? And when I think back to Mr. Ron Henry, the gentleman that I showed you before from the Navy Warfare Center, that was the link between the two halves of that particular warfare center, right? What are the retention or succession plans for them? How are you going to make sure these people stick around? How are you going to reward and recognize them? So all important questions if you want to increase the capacity and maintain the capacity for innovation of your organization. All right, let's go on to another concept. Let's go on to the concept of propagation of knowledge. And here, we're basically using an epidemiological model. Basically, what we're saying is that a good idea is like a virus. A good sticky idea propagates from person to person to person, okay, just as a virus does. Okay? So how would you characterize a network in terms of the spread of a virus or a good idea? Well, there's a network parameter that is called the largest connected component. Basically, the way you calculate that is you start with any single inventor, and what you do is you keep counting how many people they're connected to. In other words, if you started with Jim as the inventor, you would go out to the first person that Jim invented with, and that's the first count. Then you look at that person and say, who did they invent with? And then you look at those first people and you say, who did they invent with? Until you run out of connections. Okay? And it's probably hard to see in the diagram, but the dark blue, almost black circles are all members of the largest connected component of this company. Down in the lower left, that bar chart shows the connected components, the frequency of the connected components, right? There were 40 lone inventors. There were on the order of 10 or 12 dyads, in other words, 2. All the way to the right, there was one component that was comprised of 450 out of the 562. Okay? That is the largest connected component. That component in this corporation was 77% of the entire innovation network. Okay? 77%. That's good. We looked at the Navy, and they ranged anywhere, the 5 Navy labs we characterized, they ranged anywhere from 9% to 51%. The 9% organization was known as a highly politicized organization, and what it looked like was a collection of isolated caves where very little information flowed from cave to cave. When we went out and looked at commercial companies that were known for being some of the most innovative in their industry, what we found was that typically these organizations had a largest connected component that ranged anywhere from 70 to 92%. Okay? They were up there. And what that means is that good ideas flow through those companies faster than in the company that has only a 9% connected component. Okay? So you start to ask yourself the question, particularly with these Navy labs, why the variance from 9 to 51%? What's different? What are the policies and practices that cause one group to become isolated caves and another group to have a larger connected component? What's different about the management style? What's different about leadership? What's different about their mission? So once again, what happens here is when we use this network metaphor and when we characterize the network, right, what it does is it causes you to ask a lot of very important questions. Okay. So when you look at network structure like this, in particular with respect to knowledge propagation, there are two types of links. There are structural links, right? These are pathways by which knowledge or technical expertise flows formally. For instance, you have a reporting structure. You have your organization chart. And within that organization, you have processes that say you're going to write a weekly or a monthly report on what you've accomplished. And that report goes up and down the chain. That's a structural link, right? Because it's formally put in place. A relational link are the social interactions. They're built on the interpersonal trust. And when you think about it, when we talk to most of these inventors, they'll use the structural links if they have to. But when they've got a challenge to solve, it's the relational links that they rely on. It's their friends, their trusted relations, right, that they go to with their ideas, to bounce them off them off the sounding board, right? And so that underlying social network, that network of trust relationships is really critical to getting things done. You know this yourself, right? I mean, when you've got a challenge, you don't necessarily stay within your hierarchy, your org chart, right? You go to those that you know are going to help you solve it, okay? So organizations can be looked at as both social and technical networks. Both types are important, but above all, the type that I think is most responsible for innovation are the social networks because of how trust affects the speed of propagation of knowledge across an organization. Okay, so what kind of questions would you ask? Well, first of all, you can ask a question like, what is your largest connected component? What fraction of all of your inventors, of all your researchers, okay, are connected and communicate with each other and have a trust relationship, right? If you have some isolated clusters, are they isolated for a good reason? Or do you need to form that trust bridge, right, between them and the largest connected component? Okay? What new knowledge would flow that wasn't flowing before? With that new knowledge, what innovations could you create that you couldn't create before without that knowledge? You need to ask yourself, what would the optimal connectivity look like for your organization? Remember that all these activities, they consume resources. They cost money, right? So, having 100% connectivity is not something that you're probably going to be able to afford or that you want, because you don't want to have groupthink either, okay? Then you're going to boil it down to what policies and practices could be implemented to facilitate knowledge propagation. And this is really important because when we close and we talk about cultures, one of the things that we've learned is that every human being behaves in a manner that optimizes his or her gain within the system of policies and practices put in place by leadership. Okay? And that is going to be one of the means by which you're able to design interventions to increase the capacity for innovation, to change the topology of your network. All right. Let's move on to another concept. The concept is called the innovation genotype. And again, we used another biological metaphor. We said, look, within the cell, the gene contains the knowledge, the instructions with which to produce the proteins that turn into the differentiated cells that become the organs that amount to the organism, the animal, that has its typical phenotypic characteristics. How big it is, how strong it is, how fast it can run, how high it can fly, right? And by analogy, what we said was we want to look at the inventors as if they are the genes. And we want to look at their inventions as if they are the proteins expressed by those genes, okay? And then you look at a sum of those inventions, and now maybe you get an innovation, which is the new product or service that is the characteristic that characterizes the animal that your organization is. And that's the analogy we drew. And here's how we looked at it. The next slide, what you see, this is the innovation genotypes for 5 Navy Warfare Center laboratories. Now, I know this is an eye chart, and I'm going to take you over to the next slide very shortly, which is going to just look at a section of it, right? But when you look at it, one of the amazing things you see is that as I look across the x-axis, which is the USPTO class codes, which tell me what kind of invention this is. Is this a radar invention? Right? Is this a buggy whip invention? What is it? You know, what you're going to see is there's an awful lot of overlap between the labs. Okay. The y-axis, by the way, is the number of inventions from that laboratory in that particular class code. Now, here's one of the questions the strategic questions that leadership has to ask. Okay. If this is my innovation genotype, then these are the competencies, the skills that have enabled me to be the competitor that I am today. Now the question is this: the world's evolving. I have to evolve. What should my genotype look like tomorrow? What skills and competencies in what domains do I need to remain competitive? For the Navy, warfare is changing, and it's changing dramatically. And the Navy has to look at, you know, what genes do I need tomorrow that I don't have today? How do I get those genes? Do I hire them? Do I train people in those genes? How do I get there? Now, let's go on to the small subsection that's in the red oval. And let's ask a different question. Instead of looking down the x-axis, let's look into a particular class code. And what you see here is that in many class codes, all 5 labs have a significant number of patents. Okay? Now what that tells us is that every one of those labs has expertise, has deep knowledge in those domains. But you know what? Over several decades worth of patents that we looked at, we did not find a single patent that had co-inventors from 2 or more different laboratories. Now think about that. What a great opportunity for collaboration. And as the Navy moves forward and has to face, through sequestration, more and more cuts to their resources, they have to become more collaborative. When the Navy moves forward, they have to look at the policies that cause this isolation between the different laboratories. Okay? 3 out of these 5 laboratories are within short driving distance of each other. So there's no physical separation to worry about here. Okay? This is a separation that's caused by funding policies, by different colors of money, by metaphors that the Navy uses, such as stay in your swim lane, which doesn't evoke collaboration. Okay? These are the things that those leaders that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk are looking at and asking, what can I change? And, you know, just like corporations have to live with regulations handed down by the government, so does the Navy. In fact, the Navy has probably a heavier burden than corporations do. Right? Congress is constantly laying new policy onto the Navy, which the Navy has to conform to. But the bright side of it is, when we looked at some of the policies that were identified by the Innovation Backbone members as causing this problem, this lack of collaboration, okay, it turns out that the policies were written so broadly that it's not the policy that's the problem, it's the implementation of the policy. It's the practice that people have taken for granted over the decades as being the policy. And so there's really a lot of hope that some of these practices can be changed and still can be changed for the better to increase collaboration, right? And still remain within the framework of the policy that was laid on them by Congress. Okay. So since we're using this metaphor, the obvious question is, how can we do some genetic engineering? Right? What new genes do we need to add? You know, what current competencies will become less important so that we can retrain those people? You know, which competencies should be consolidated across multiple organizations? Right? What communities of interest or communities of practice should be initiated? What software systems and communication systems could we use to increase the tacit explicit dialogue between those laboratories, right? What's our human capital plan to achieve this new genotype tomorrow? Okay? And when you look at that genotype, is it consistent with your vision and strategy? Is that the genotype that's going to get you to where you think you have to go? Remember, this is public data, right? So now you can also look at your competitors' genotypes. What do they look like? What differences are there between their genotype and yours? What does that difference tell you? Now, where are they going to be able to invent that you're not going to be able to invent, right? And how are they changing over time? We did some time-lapse of some of these things, and it's pretty amazing when you look at the time-lapse evolution of the genotype and the information network. Well, one of the ways you can expand your genotype is through collaboration, right? Because you may not be able to hire everybody you need. You may not be able to retrain everybody, okay? So again, remembering that this is public data, you can go out there and find out who to collaborate with. And in the next slide, what I show you is this. Metamaterials is becoming very important to a lot of companies, and it is to the Navy too. This is the last couple of years' worth of data that shows the innovation networks that are producing inventions related to metamaterials. Now, metamaterials is not a PTO code yet, so you have to do searches for certain phrases in the patent. But if you look at this, all of these are organizations that are doing work in metamaterials. Which one of those organizations would you like to collaborate with? Which one of those organizations might you want to acquire? Which one of those people, and by the way, in this one, we've highlighted the people with the highest neutrino centrality. This gentleman right here happens to be the gentleman that coined the term metamaterials, the blue. Okay? But you now have a lot of information. If you're going to acquire one of these networks, you want to make sure that that innovation network, innovation backbone comes with it, right? If one of these is a college or a university, you want to know who these people are. These are the people that you want to take and look seriously at for hires. Okay? You want to look at this organization for a collaboration. So again, because it's public data, you can get a lot of business intelligence by looking at these networks that you could never have otherwise. Okay? All right. And this is what we were saying before. There are targets for collaboration, acquisition, and hiring, right? And we're even working with an organization now looking at how we could use innovation networks plus genotypes to drive economic development at the state level. Okay, let me move on, right? And what I want to close with here, and then I want to give you some time for your questions, all right, is that the work that we're doing now is an extension of the innovation network, right? And what we're doing is we've built a model for the Navy on creating a culture of innovation, looking at that culture as a collective intelligence. Okay. I'm sure everyone remembers his famous phrase, Houston, we have a problem. Okay. And, other than the Navy, I'm sure NASA is probably the most anal retentive organization in trying to plan for every single contingency that might be thought of. But here's Apollo 13, and a simple little circuit while they're trying to agitate the liquid oxygen tanks, okay, creates a spark and an explosion, something that they never had planned for. Now, look at Gene Kranz's Mission Control statement, right? Because 6 days later, they brought those astronauts back alive, right? And what he said was the culture of this room was literally miraculous. It seemed that whatever happened, we were better as a total team than the sum of the parts. That is collective intelligence. And you say, so what? Why do I need collective intelligence? Well, this is a chart that I've adapted, and the source is Dr. Dale Moore, the director of the Strategic Cell to the Naval Air Warfare Center Aircraft Division. And what it's got is environmental change and complexity. And you see this graph going up here almost exponentially, right? And the dotted line at the bottom here is the traditional mental model of taking 5 years' worth of data, right, and basically planning and extending it out, extrapolating it linearly to figure out what the vision, strategy, and plan should be. And what Dr. Moore's point is that this difference here, this difference between the dotted line and the solid line, is driven by the 21st century's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Okay? That's important because we are up here today. Apollo 13 was down here. This VUCA environment, this complexity, okay, has grown tremendously. And the only way that we're going to survive is by creating the largest possible collective intelligence for our organization. So next slide 34 is the model. And basically, if any of you have listened to Simon Sinek's talk, on how great leaders inspire people, you'll notice that this is his golden circle. The outside circle is the what. The inside circle, that's the products and services of an organization. The inside circle is the why. Why an organization exists, its higher purpose. What we've done is we've replaced the inner circle, the inner ring, which was the how, the secret sauce in Sinek's terms, right, with this model of culture. Culture as a collective intelligence. And it's comprised of 4 components, which I'll very briefly explain to you, and then we're going to wrap this up, all right? The underlying social network, that's the innovation networks we've been looking at. The networks of trust between people who have the tacit knowledge and are motivated by your challenges, okay? They contain the social capital, which is the stock of active connections among people and the trust that will help your organization to solve any challenge it comes up against, any challenge, right? The other 3 components are very interesting because when you ask yourself, why is my underlying social network the way it is? Why does it have that topology? The answer is it's driven by the acceptable behavior patterns for the organization. Whatever behavior patterns are normal for your organization, they define the levels of trust between people. But then you back up further and you ask yourself in box 2, you say, well, wait a minute, what determines our behavior patterns? And the answer to that, and there's a lot more to it, and I'm not going to go into it here, but basically it's your collective explicit knowledge. And one subset of the organization's collective explicit knowledge, that one subset is its policies and practices. People's behavior will be determined by leadership's policies and practices. Okay. Finally, the 4th element of this model of culture is the organization's shared tacit knowledge. Right? These are the mental models, the paradigms in Thomas Kuhn's words, okay, by which we operate. They determine, these mental models, what questions we will ask, how we will approach answering those questions, and what answers we will find acceptable. When you put these 4 elements together, these define a culture. And by the way, we got here in 2 ways. One by going from the network model of innovation side. The other by studying many different models of a culture, right? Both sociological models and anthropological models. And by the way, there's over 150 different models out there in the literature. And taking elements from each and putting them together with Nonaka and Polanyi's theory of knowledge and some other things that we had learned from the network model, and that's how we arrived at this. We are now working with several warfare centers, helping them to design their culture of innovation using this model. And we're going to be able to compare across warfare centers. And as I mentioned earlier, for this model, you can apply all 4 generations of metrics from the innovation metrics from the President's Council, right? So this is not a squishy, soft model that you might get from some anthropologist or sociologist, right? This is a model that will help leadership define the interventions it must take, right? All right. What I try to do with this slide is basically say, look, how do you communicate all this stuff in a couple of seconds in terms people are going to be familiar with? And we all know there's this old management paradigm, right, about talking the talk and walking the walk, right? And we all said that leaders must not only just talk the talk, but walk the walk. But if you sit down and you think about this, okay, the talking the talk is the collective explicit, whether it's actually a talk or whether it's a policy we publish, right? The walking the walk, that's the acceptable behavior pattern. But by the way, before I could do either of those, as a leader, I've got to think the thought. I've got to have that mental model. You know, I've just recently reread A Business and Its Beliefs by Thomas J. Watson Jr. You know, and he had 3 basic beliefs, 3 mental models that he built IBM on. Right? And I worked for IBM for 17 years, and at that point in time, it was the Watson culture, and it was fantastic. Okay. Now, the last thing I'm going to tell you is it's not enough. If you're going to make a collective intelligence, it's not enough to just have the leader think the thought, talk the talk, and walk the walk. Leadership has to empower everyone to think, talk, and walk in support of the organization's overriding purpose, its why. Okay, that's it. Jim, with that, if there's any questions.
Hi, Gary, thank you. First of all, let me do an administrative. The bar associations are the people who require me to do it this way. I wait to the end, and then I give you a CLE credit code. The code is 1686 1686. You need to complete and return the attorney affirmation form within 48 hours. You need to email it to professionaldevelopment@ropesgray.com, and the fax number is there on the screen, 1-617-235-9606. Now, as noted, there's been a recording of today's presentation, and within a week we'll send out to the registrants a link to the slides and also a link to the recording so that you can use this later. There are a couple of things that, questions, but before that I wanted to make a comment. I was going to say that I'd suggest that people Google the phrase VUCA, V-U-C-A, and see what comes up. I think there's some interesting articles and examples about living in a VUCA world, and it is an extraordinary concept. The second is I wanted to go back a few slides and ask some questions. Gary, it looked to me, just to use your example, of the meta materials.
Yes.
That it seemed to me that there were really three big networks at play. One in the center bottom, one on the bottom right, and one on the left towards the top. Excuse me, on the right towards the top.
On the right towards the top, yeah.
And that if you were interested in acquisition, disruption, that focusing on those networks, this gave you a very clear map of who you needed to talk to and who you needed to either collaborate or compete with.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, it's amazing how much intelligence you can derive from this, okay? First of all, one very simple thing to do is just simply invite the people that are the backbone of these networks. Like, for instance, the one in the lower center, right? If you invited the person that is on that blue dot, okay, that person could probably tell you everything about that entire network. And you don't have to go and talk to all 20 or 30 people, right? By the way, if you were to hire away that blue dot, you would tear that network apart. And you would severely hurt your competition. So there's a lot of intelligence that you can get out of these networks, right?
Yeah, the one on the top right, there are two dots, black dots, that would, again, tear apart that network, while the one on the bottom right looks like it's a more durable network that would be much harder to dismantle and much easier to acquire intact, and if the culture fit, could be a very powerful acquisition.
It could be. And that one has in terms of clustering, that network has probably a higher clustering coefficient. In other words, if you look at all the available possible triads, three inventors connected together, you look at that diagram and you can see that almost every triad that's possible is connected, right? Whereas in the center one, the one with the red, blue, and green dots, right, that's not that connected. It's more, the triads are not all completed, okay? So there are different characteristics. One network you may want to hire away one or two people. The other network you might want to acquire the whole group, okay? Or no matter what network you might want to acquire or collaborate with, you want to make sure that those key people that are part of the innovation backbone, that are the key bridgers, okay, you want to make sure they're involved in the transaction, whatever it be, acquisition, collaboration, hiring. Well, they are the people that understand how innovation happens in that domain.
So, Gary, I think you've got a couple of quick examples because we've come to the end of the hour. But, this is interesting theory. can you give a couple of examples where you've actually used it to accomplish some objectives, make some money or save some money? Can you talk in a practical, tangible way about these intangibles?
Yeah, where we're at right now with this stuff is as I said, several of the warfare centers are implementing these models. They're changing their cultures based upon this model and upon the network theory. Okay, in terms of some practical things, recently one of the warfare centers ran a massive online game. Okay, where they were trying to look at the intersection of 3D printing and of unmanned vehicles, and what that would mean when you intersected 3D printing unmanned vehicles. And we were able to go out there and find some really interesting people and have those people present to the group online about their technology. So the latest knowledge was being drawn from these outside networks into this internal network of Navy researchers that were brainstorming these problems.
Well, I am very appreciative of this information, and I know our group is as well, but we have come to the end of the hour and gone just a few minutes beyond it. If individuals have questions that they want to email Gary or myself about, please feel free to do it. Make sure you return the attorney affirmation forms, and the materials have your email on the front, but you might as well go ahead, Gary, and give them your email address as a closing item. And I want to thank you very much for your presentation and your efforts here.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. I'll give you the email and the phone number. The email is Gary, Gary, at innovationbp.com. So it's the word innovation, INNOVATION, B like in boy, P like in poppy.com. And its phone number, it appears on the slide there, is 914-474-9499. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. We're very excited about what's happening here, and I'd be more than happy to talk to anyone that's interested in more details. Jim, thank you for the opportunity.
You're very welcome, and that ends today's Ropes and Gray IP Masterclass, and join us for future classes. Thank you very much, Gary, and to our audience. Bye now.
This concludes today's webinar.